You know, this is such a broad topic. I kept on saying, I'm going to ask them that. No, not that. I'm going to ask them that. It is new, it's scary, and you said something about the media or the newspapers being underfunded. I'm sadly have to say that they're not underfunded. It is the interest has gone elsewhere. If people were interested in newspapers still, there would be advertisers and newsrooms wouldn't be shrinking as ours are across the country. They shrink our newsrooms and we keep producing, and the advertisers are going digital as well. So as the world goes digital, so does the money. And you know, that's where we go necessarily. So now we're getting into a period, a pre-election period. Just somehow started a little bit. There was a federal budget, like what was it, last week or 2 weeks ago, that came and went and nobody talked about it because there's this like shiny object happening. So policy has been buried completely under a story about a he said, she said. As shocking as it may be, people have their own opinion. I will not comment on who's right, who's wrong, because I seriously don't know. But what is interesting is that we do not cover policy unless we force our newsrooms to, because people don't want to see, don't want to hear that allegedly. But when a big story happens, like a budget, then people come to us. The SNC-Lavalin story, people come to us. So our audiences we do very well when there is something like that. So they see their first hints on social media, Facebook, Twitter, wherever they go, and then they want to know, really, what's going on? And then they will come to us. Sometimes, not always.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, you know, and I've been thinking about this. So
it's not supposed to be this.
I know, but I'm gonna. But like, it's interesting because you mentioned SNC-Lavalin just as an example, right? That you see there's an audience there, so you continue to produce content and cover it. Back in the quote olden days, where you didn't have those instant analytics to know what your audience wanted. You did a newspaper story, it went in the paper, it got to people's doors, they read it. You had no way to know really whether it was something they wanted to read. Is that a problem? Is that part of it, that we aren't producing content that people should be reading instead of going after content that they seemingly want to read? And I just wonder if that is part of this.
Can I answer the question?
You know what? Analytics is not something I ever look at. I'm just a journalist, right? And you know, I wake up in the morning and I know that that's the story of the day and that's what I'm going to cover. So I'm not that smart.
The
I don't know.
SNC-Lavalin story, I don't think anybody would have said they wanted to read it because they didn't know it existed. So
you cover, you know, you sort of cover. You just sort of cover the news. We tried to cover the budget. God knows I was interested in it. I was more interested in the budget that day than anything else because it's the last budget before a federal election, because that's what we're going to live with, not the political story. That's there, that's the noise, but the real story is the budget. What does it mean to us? What will it mean to us in the future? How will it be adopted? And how will it be applied? That's not what we covered. We covered, yes, the budget that day, and then it disappeared into SNC-Lavalin hell, and we're still there, really, right? We follow the story that's there. We don't look at analytics in the morning with the producers and say, oh yeah, this is what people are. It doesn't work that way. In the real world of journalism, it doesn't work that way. You follow the story. But what I want to ask you is, so we're going towards a less controlled, right? We have people who read our scripts and tell us you can't use that word, that would be offensive. Did you double check or triple check this fact? Do you have two sources? And despite what people say, fake news is not coming from us, really. Most of the fake news is out there somewhere in this sinister world that the clerk of the Privy Council called a vomitorium. On the stand. And you know, he's a little bit wrong and he's a little bit right. So I want to ask you, we know how we are controlled. We have editors, we have, you know, anchor people, we sit down, we write our scripts, we double check our facts, and we actually do that. It's not true that we don't. how do you control and how are these people and the millions of people that are going to go to the polls in October know where the truth is from, excuse my expression, the bullshit? And there's a lot of it out there. And some of it is sinister, and some of it is scary, and some of it is calls to violence. Recently, there were death threats against the reporters that are covering the SNC-Lavalin story in a yellow vest Facebook website somewhere buried. And I wondered, why do they want to kill us? So how are people, now that we have to sort of pay attention, because this will, fashion the next 4 years of our life, how are people supposed to know where to look, what to look for, and where the fake news is, because it's not coming from us?
Well, I'd say a couple things very quickly. One, an election is probably a time when they want the fire department. They're paying more attention than normal. Two, the key question that I think we need to ask ourselves is not where do people access news, which is an important question, but where does news originate? And there's nothing holy or magic or deserving about newspapers. And all the work we've done, we've said this over and over again. We're not out to protect newspapers, we're out to protect journalism. And if journalism exists in new digital startups, that's great. If journalism exists in television newsrooms, that's great. If journalism exists in newspapers, if journalism exists freelance, however journalism exists, that's the important part. Now, newspapers have been actually a very good way for journalism to organize itself, so that's fine. But there's nothing inherently magic about that. And then the third thing I'd say is I think the most sinister part of what we're talking about, and David sort of got it a little bit around the messaging, the number of ads and things like this. As I understand, the Trump campaign put out 50,000 messages a week. 50,000, micro-targeted groups as small as a dozen people. So we have, I see Susan Delacourt back there hiding under her hair, and Susan wrote a book about this, really early on, before it, became a really sinister issue. And that's the problem, because nobody knows what anybody's saying. There's not a common basis of facts on which to organize. So that's the problem. Who's going to control it, Joyce? Nobody's in the news system. They're, the people who patrol the borders of truth and non-truth, or fringe views or extreme views and non-extreme views. That's collapsed. That has collapsed, and I'm not precisely sure how we put it together, but I don't think we're going back to gatekeepers like me deciding what you get to see. And there's a lot of good that we're not going back to that.
So what are people telling you in your research? Are they getting more cynical? Are they?
I think we've been talking about this lack of trust, right? There's a deep lack of trust, particularly in Edelman's Trust Barometer really showed that this year, that if you distinguish between those who are engaged in public life, those who follow the news regularly, those who seek it out, as opposed to those who are passive consumers, the trust gap is really large, right? So those who are much more passive about news, maybe consume it every now and then, they might vote, they might not, they don't trust institutions, they don't trust the media all that much, they don't trust government all that much, they don't trust big business all that much. And so as a result, it's hard to create gatekeepers and truth tellers in an environment where your tribal instinct is what's actually driving what you believe, right? I've done some media research for some organizations, and they all believe that they are unbiased, telling the facts that it is, and then are shocked when I tell them that half of their audience thinks they are biased, that half their audience thinks they are not telling the truth as it is. That when I go and interview in focus groups, Fox News or Sun News, I used to be the Sun News pollster a long time ago, those viewers, they think that those news organizations are the truth tellers, that they are the ones telling the truth. And then you go and you interview CBC or CTV or Toronto Star readers and viewers, they believe that those news organizations are telling the truth and the others aren't. And so we're increasingly living in a world where, this is the point, truth is relative. And people don't necessarily believe that, but they live that experience. And so it's very hard to fight misinformation and tell the real truth, particularly when, even if you look, and I don't want to bring up SNC again, her truth versus his truth, the public's like, just tell me the truth. But we can't get at the truth, right? Or they can't seem
Well,
to
that
get at
is the truth, actually. Sometimes that's what
And
it
that's
is.
I think that's a microcosm of this larger issue, right? And so I'm not sure what the antidote is or the solution, because government stepping in and saying we're going to regulate and decide what truth is. Most people would say I'm not comfortable with that because I don't trust government in the first place.
And that's what I want to ask you. So there's the fake news, and how do you control it? By controlling it or trying to control it out there, then there's a pillar in our democracy. It's free speech. And freedom of information, free speech. It is a pillar. If you start touching that, it is a domino effect. But so how do you deal with that? Can you even deal with it?
No, I mean, it's the genie's out of the bottle, right? Like we can't, I think Ed was saying exactly right, that I always say, you can always just turn off Twitter, but you can't turn off Twitter if you're a person who's like found their voice and is creating a community on Twitter. Then that is the place where that conversation needs to happen, and it's very few, that free speech piece is very important. One of the things that I was struck by when you were talking about the budget was that, on the front page of a newspaper that I won't name, was like on the day of the budget, it was 100% opinion. And I thought, that is a problem too, right? Because it does sort of reinforce to Canadians that it's opinion that matters and not necessarily fact, and that they were leading with, four opinion columns. It does kind of make you think about, okay, now I only go to the people that I trust, and I only listen to their opinion, and I don't try to get at, what is this budget, and how does it work, and what's it going to do for me or not going to do for me? So that would just say, that was an interesting point on it. And then similarly, I remember with the New York Times, when the Mueller report came out, they were talking about it online, and they said, how many stories did we miss because we were thinking only about whether Trump was working with Russia? And so even though we have journalists that have wonderful journalistic integrity, there's an innumerable number of stories to follow, and so figuring out where to follow that. And I do think that we do need a strong journalist saying, like, this, I'm going to take you somewhere that you may not want to go, but we're going to go there. And then the question is, how do you get people to actually read it?
Go ahead.
Hi there, my name's David Lockheed. I'm a Master of Journalism student here at Carleton. And the question I had is, now that journalism is moving onto multiple platforms and we are dealing with more data, how do you see journalism as a medium organizing this data in a way that's in the mass amount of stories that's accessible for viewers, readers, or people that are taking in that content?
I guess I'm stuck with that. Okay, if I'm answering that question, I want to say something about free speech also. So if I understand, you're just asking how you organize on different platforms.
Right, so if there is multiple stories out there and they have some kind of link to each other, how, if you are going to consume that news, can you reference back to other stories that connect with it, or information when it comes to data that may connect with that, instead of just going on a certain website and maybe missing the links between there that kind of would make that person lose some understanding of the full story?
Okay, well, let's first of all say that how people consume information is in their hands, and whether they want to go through links and whether they want to go to the relateds. But digital, one of the gifts of digital is it enables you to, to do that, to, put things, embed things into things. And, if you look at the Globe site as opposed to the Globe paper, for instance, you'll see the story, and then you'll see, 3 previous stories that are kind of related to that story. And in the story, you might have links to things. and the world does actually become more connected and more and more holistic there. So, I think that's that's good and great for the very few people who are going to do that. But if we can get critical thinking, civic education, civic engagement, together, maybe people would do more of that. If I may just say something about your question on free speech for 1 second before we go to you, I'm sorry if that's okay. I kind of think, I remember there's this expression that, Canada's a country that doesn't work in theory, it only works in practice. And I think that's sort of a little bit true of what you said about free speech. I mean, to have no journalists, or fewer and fewer journalists every year, and I think the numbers we have now are showing like another 20% drop since we did Shattered Mirror or something. I can't remember exact numbers. That's not good for free speech. To have a system where you can't discern what's true and what's not true, that's not really great for free speech either. The idea is not to have the government tell you what is fair speech in that. When I was editor of the Globe and Mail, the editor, the publisher, and the proprietor were legally responsible for every word and image and advertisement and letter to the editor, whether we created or not, that we disseminated on any platform. And first off, the platform should have the same responsibility because they are editors. Editing really has two things to it. It has selection. These are the stories I want to do today. This is, what I'm going to tell you, and it has hierarchy, and this is the order we're going to put them in. And the platforms do that too. So defamation is, defamation actually is hinders your free speech. But I think we accept that hindrance of free speech. So it's a question of, what is reasonable and how can you organize that? And it may be just through civil law or whatever. It may not have the government involved. Sorry.
Hi, Danielle again from Apathy is Boring. My question kind of applies to all of you. As one of the heads of a youth organization whose main focus is accessible communication and young and friendly and youth-friendly communications, what do you think, or how do you think that you guys, or how would you rate how well all of you are doing at making sure your communications is youth-friendly and diverse? So Abacus, for example, I know that we've worked with you on several surveys and research, and I'm kind of always the one drilling Samantha to make sure that we get a diverse pool of audience in the respondents of the research that we do. So how do you guys go about, respectively, in your work, in your organizations, making sure that, one, you're talking to a youth audience who's increasingly important, two, you're talking to a diverse youth audience?
No, it's such an important question, and I think that it's very difficult to promise that you have done that, and I think often it's about asking people to take what we do as Samara and use it for the thing that they need to use it for. So we can't speak to all audiences, so how can we help you tell your story that needs to be told to young people? It's something we could probably improve on. But when you do research into communities, whether it's surveys or focus groups, we always oversample for youth so that we can dive deep onto that. So we did instead of doing a 1,000 person survey this year, we did a 4,000 person survey so that we can actually get into some of the different divisions around age lines. So that's one of the ways we try.
I think most proud of the work we've done on trying to bring youth voices into Ottawa and sort of putting a spotlight on those issues. I think when you think of the budget and the focus on housing as an example, I don't think we're not advocates for youth. That's not our role, but I think we ask questions. in ways that perhaps other research companies don't, that tries to get at that. But diversity, on your question about diversity, it's always difficult because we sometimes paint those who look one way and those who look another way as two, distinct groups, but that share similar things. But within those groups, there's such diversity itself. And so when you do survey research, there's only so much and so many people we can interview from each of those groups to really understand what's driving them. So I think we try to put a lens to some of that, but it's very hard to tell stories when you sort of cut them all into pieces. So that's the instinct not to.
So then how do you know that your research is representative?
Well, I know our samples are representative because I know what the census says and I know what our data says. It's not, I think people assume because we don't put a gendered lens or a racialized group lens on some research that it's not representative. I think that's a false premise. It's that we don't have time, or maybe you're right, we don't have, not time, but there's only so much of a story we can say in 150 characters, right? And so maybe I think you're right, we should be doing more of it. But it's not to say that those voices aren't represented in the research. They're just a minority, and so they get often covered by what the majority views are on a lot of things.
I would just add, from a PPF perspective, our staff is much more diverse than staff that I had in journalism. Our staff is 70% women. It's 25% non-white. It's pretty diverse staff. So I think it starts there. They all did gender training last week, and looking at how our research goes through a lens like that. But we've been particularly focused on think tanks tend to be old guy places. And they're not all 33-year-old led like me, but we've brought in a group called Action Canada, which is a youth leadership thing, which is now part of Public Policy Forum, and it's got alumni about 250, 300 people, and we're very conscious about trying to get a broader range demographically, particularly on age at this point. I would say involved, so it's not just an old white established privileged view of the world.
Well, television newsrooms are not, our audience is not young because young people don't have cable. They don't watch newscasts, those traditional newscasts. They get their news elsewhere. So difficult for us to reach young people unless they go on Facebook and see one particular report that was then put on Facebook, or if one of the reporters puts their report on Twitter and so on. That's how news is shared from our more traditional newsrooms to the audience that is not interested in us anymore. So we have an older audience. You can see that from the advertisement that is on our political shows, for instance. And so what we do in order to keep that diversity is I've hired a lot of young people because I think it's important, because we think differently. We think more in the traditional way of looking at things, whereas our young producers and young reporters would look at things differently and perhaps even be able to bring some more young people, not necessarily at 11 o'clock, those news appointments that were traditional years ago, but that would go on Facebook, on Twitter, and social media to watch us. So that's the only thing we can do. I mean, look at the ads, and you'll know that our target audience is probably over 50 or even 60, right? And
So do you think that young people lost interest because you weren't talking to them? Or do you think that you stopped talking to them because they weren't listening?
No, I don't think it's because we were not talking to them. There are a lot of young people in our newsrooms. I think it's because just the times have changed. It's more practical. You have an iPhone. You don't need me anymore. So it is what it is, right? That's the way it's going. You'll look on your iPhone. That's what I do when I'm in the taxi. I'll look at Facebook and I'll go get some news in there too myself, right? When our kids moved out, we got them cable, and 6 months later they told us, dude, we don't need it. So, and they didn't, and they're smart, and they're au courant, and they follow the news in a different magical world that of theirs, and it's not mine.
And let me just say, I think, as the one who looks certainly the youngest on stage here,
No.
and I can speak.
What?
Wait.
Hey, come
No, hey, people think I can't drink in most provinces in this country still, so let's, it's part of my, like, identity now that I've got, like, obsessive, like, youthfulness. But I also think, just to push back on your point, there's a responsibility for young people to get engaged,
Yeah.
to look for news. That the fact that my sister, and I'll use her as an example again, didn't know what happened where her brother lives in the nation's capital is indicative, yes, partly on how the news talked to her, but she has no instinct or interest in finding out what's going on in the world, right? She went on a vacation last week and didn't know that the plane she was going to fly on had been grounded around the world, right? The top story globally was that Boeing's planes had been put, she didn't know that her flight was going to, and that's why it was canceled. Right? So to me, there's two sides of this coin, and I think the work that
you were going to be in so much
I
trouble.
know
when she's watching the live
she's not
streaming
watching
right
She
now.
doesn't. It's all good. She's not watching. But I think the work you're doing at Apathy is Boring is part of that, right? Is to engage young people and to remind them they have a voice when they engage and vote. We saw in 2015 they change outcomes. We saw in the UK they change outcomes. In the US as well. But they've got to want to look for that information. And if you create the audience, I promise you, the CTV will serve them. But right now, to Joyce's point, they're not watching. And so it's the same, it's supply and demand. And it's why the politicians didn't care for years what young people cared. But the moment they showed up and voted,
Yeah.
Justin Trudeau appointed himself Minister of Youth. So
100%.
it's a loop.
Yeah.
And the work you're doing is really important as part of that.
We're into lunch. People are going to start getting hangry. So,
So my name is Catherine Soplit. I'm a member of Peel Poverty Action Group, and I understand exactly why people get hangry. I am a community contributor to.
Closer to the mic slightly. Thank you.
I'm a community contributor to a scrappy little digital newspaper called Peel Weekly News. And I'm here today because our millennial digital editor said, you're going to be in Ottawa for the Progress Summit, so you better come to this thing and tell me what is going on. So I wanted to draw attention to civic engagement and the power of the press and a possible remedy for reaching people who are ready to learn with the truth. So first of all, in 2015, when Vote Pop-Up came out from Samara, Peel Poverty Action Group was an early adopter. We did a trial with the Mississauga Library System. We reported back to John Beebe, and he fed that information back through the momentum of the network. And as a result, big things happened in Nova Scotia, big things happened in Calgary, where the Vote Pop-Up kit was taken on by the library as a thing that community groups could take out, sign out like a book, and do a project about voter engagement and how to vote and get people registered. So people are ready to learn when they go to public libraries. They self-regulate, and what I'm going to suggest is that you take your newsroom on the show and book a room in the public library. They'll give it to you free, and invite people in to talk. Youth love to talk to seniors about politics. The libraries are full. They need our protection, and Peel Poverty Action Group is making a federal campaign of universal bandwidth in every municipal public library across Canada. Please cover that story.
why are you looking at me? Well, what's that? That's it for us. Is that it? I'm getting all these. Thank you for this. We obviously will never get to the bottom of this, but at least there's some food for thought. And also, I think real food. Is that it? That's what it's supposed to be. So thanks for being here, and the show will continue after lunch. Yes, there you go.